Hello and welcome in. This is attorney Jamie Miller, and welcome to another Miller Law Chronicles podcast. Today, Deborah Stencel is going to join me as my co-host, and we're going to talk about the complicated situation of the non-filing spouse in bankruptcy. So we get the question all the time, if I'm married, does my wife or partner need to file? Under what circumstances should they file? Under what circumstances should they not file? And we're going to talk about that in depth to give you some great insight into that. I appreciate you so much listening to the podcast week after week. If you like us, please subscribe at Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Like us at YouTube. It's going to allow us to continue to bring this great content to you as we move forward. Thank you and have a great day. Good morning and welcome in. This is attorney Jamie Miller with another edition of our Miller Law Chronicles podcast. And today I'm here again with my co-host, Deborah Stencel. Good morning, Deborah.
Good morning, Jamie.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for joining me again today. It's always wonderful to have you as a guest and always enjoy our banter back and forth. I do have my Boston Terrier puppy sitting on my lap, and so I can show him to our audience. This is Mickey, who is, if I put him in his crate, he will cry. I don't want him to disturb what we're doing, but we can move forward and understand that I have a dog here with me, right? So do you. You had a dog issue this morning. What happened?
Oh, my dogs are big dogs. Their combined weight is about 210. And the bleach was out on the kitchen floor for no apparent good reason. And one of them tussled with the other, knocked the bleach over, broke the bottle, and 3/4 of a gallon of bleach spilled. And the dogs ran off and they're fine. But that smell is like in my brain right now. It's just, ugh.
When you say broke the bottle, did the cap fall off or something?
Well, you know what? The bottle was cracked. So it leaked.
Okay.
Like it fell over and I was
Got
like,
it.
oh, the bleach fell over. And then I noticed the smell and turned around and realized it was out.
I hope your house must smell very clean or toxic.
I'm leaning towards toxic right now,
Okay.
but I've escaped. I'm in my parents' house, so.
Okay, good. Because I was going to ask if you were at your house and it's toxic, just stay there till the podcast is done and then you should leave.
Okay.
Today, we're going to talk about a really interesting topic. It's one that comes up periodically in many bankruptcies that we deal with and came up in a couple of our meetings this week. And that has to do with the question when we have a married couple, whether the married couple should file a joint bankruptcy or they should file individually. So I wanted to talk about that and get some of your insights. Maybe tell me a little bit about what your experience is when you get that call, someone wants to file a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy, and they ask, should my wife file with me? Should my husband file with me? What are some of the questions that you want to know when you talk to that person right away to be able to answer that question?
There's a lot of questions to ask when a person says that to me. I usually start with, how long have you been married? And how long have you lived in a community property state? Because if they are only married for a few months or only just moved to a community property state, then maybe we don't have a problem with them not filing together. But there's more questions even beyond that. Why don't you want to file together? What do you think that's going to accomplish for you? What do you like to ask first, Jamie?
Yeah, I think that's the question. I mean, one of the big things is why, why doesn't your spouse want to file? Well, the big thing, well, I've only been married for a couple years and most of these debts were incurred pre-filing. Sometimes you get situations where the other spouse isn't the one that's working and the spouse that wants to file is the one that's filing. I tell you, one of the other issues is I was a bad spouse. I went out and charged $30,000 in credit cards, or I gambled $30,000 in credit cards, and I don't want to take the other spouse down with me. So there's a litany of reasons. And One of the other things that concerns me, and I always ask, does your spouse know that you're having this conversation?
Mhm.
Is a really important thing. And then the other situation is when a husband and a wife or a partnership where they're going through a divorce and some of the implications with the divorce. Hey, my divorce lawyer told me to talk to a bankruptcy lawyer because my husband and I just filed for divorce. We're going to be divorced in the next 6 months and we don't know what to do about the debts. So when you get that divorce question, they're going through a divorce, they're not divorced yet. What are some of your thoughts on how to deal with that?
Well, I like to say if a bankruptcy as Chapter 7, for instance, is appropriate for you and will save you money on divorce fees and divorce lawyer fees, can you get along enough to file jointly and make decisions together to get through this relatively quick process so we can move forward? Because if they can't communicate, it's awfully hard to represent both of them. But if they can make a commitment to communicate and get through this, then we can save them a lot of heartache on the divorce side if bankruptcy is appropriate.
If there's a lot of joint debt and somebody goes and files for divorce, let's say the husband files for bankruptcy, the wife doesn't, you can go into divorce court. The wife is still responsible for the debts, and the divorce judge can say, hey, client, I know you filed for bankruptcy, but your wife is still on the hook for $30,000 in debt. You're responsible for half of that. So even though the bankruptcy is going to discharge the obligation between the filing spouse and the creditors, it's not necessarily going to discharge the client's responsibility when it comes to that non-filing spouse. So one of the big questions is, tell us about your debts. Are the debts joint? Were they incurred during the marriage? Were they incurred before the marriage? What about assets? Talk about that a little bit. And when you're talking to a client about combined assets and why that can be an important conversation.
In a community property state like Wisconsin, the assets you accumulate during the marriage belong to both of you, unless there's an exception, and one of them is inherited property. That wouldn't necessarily become community property. So you have to really get into what's going on. But if it's a couple that have been married for 10 years and they have invested in their home together and their cars together, and only one of them wants to file a bankruptcy, there's quite a bit of analysis to be done on whether that is the best choice for them.
What about exemptions and how that comes into play?
So we're all allowed to keep a certain amount of stuff when we file bankruptcy. And the rules that cover that are called exemptions. One person gets so many dollars. A married couple, in almost all cases, gets double. But if only one person files bankruptcy, they only get one set of exemptions. So it may actually be better for the couple to protect their joint assets to file together. If the house is worth 300,000, they owe 150,000, they are going to need to file together to protect the house.
Right. So it's important to talk about and disclose all your assets. And the lawyer that you talk to may say, listen, if you want to protect your home, you both need to file. Or if you want to protect your car, you both need to file. Talk to me about the Chapter 13 situation when one client wants to file and maybe they're behind on a car payment, they've had the car for a while, and what issues could come up in that type of situation?
Well, Chapter 13 allows us sometimes to change the terms of the car contract. We can adjust the interest, and sometimes we can adjust the balance. It depends. But what that means is that there's a part of the contract that is unpaid. And in a bankruptcy that's successfully completed, that doesn't matter because whatever's not paid is discharged. And then you get your title to your car. But if you have a married couple and it's a joint car debt and only one files, you don't get any of those benefits because the spouse who didn't file is going to owe the money that was not paid. That's something to consider as well.
So if I have a car that I purchased with my spouse and I had the car, let's say it's a Kia Telluride, and I purchased the Kia Telluride and it hasn't gotten stolen yet.
Right.
So if I purchased the Kia Telluride and 3 years ago, I owe 30,000 on it and it's worth 15,000.
Mm.
Tell me about that situation, in that specific, because we see that a lot.
Right. So your car that you have been paying on for 3 years is so far upside down that I can now put that in a Chapter 13 and cram it down. You only have to pay its value, not what you owe. In your example, you pay the $15,000 plus interest over the life of the bankruptcy, and the remaining 15 grand is theoretically discharged at the end of the case. That is a huge benefit of Chapter 13s to save you money on a car. Basically, it gets you out of a bad deal you made. That joint debt, again, the problem is the spouse who didn't file is still on the hook for that money that the spouse who filed discharged. You have to look at all of these things. I had a couple once, and it goes in the other direction, Jamie, but I love this story. We'll call them Bernie and Mary. All right. Bernie and Mary had pretty decent income together. They did not qualify for a Chapter 7 as a joint couple. But Mary had almost $500,000 in student loans, which meant that they did not, as a couple, qualify for a Chapter 13 because their debt was too high. So what we did for Bernie and Mary was Bernie filed a Chapter 13 to pay their joint debt, and Mary was able to do a 7. So they both got a discharge at different times, but as a married couple, they worked together to make the system work for them. So that was an example of when you disclose all of your stuff and talk about all of the ramifications with your lawyer, you can end up with the best results.
Yeah, and that's important. And it's so we're seeing it in Milwaukee, we see people file bankruptcy pro se, meaning they file without a lawyer. And we are here to help people, of course. But I want to warn people that you may hear on the street that, hey, you can file bankruptcy on your own and you don't need a lawyer, but there's risks. And when it comes to this non-filing spouse issue, that can be a risk. You could lose assets. You could get an objection to your bankruptcy and not get a discharge. The other issue that people that file pro se that don't really have counsel to help them, because the bankruptcy process is complicated, is the income situation. So if someone files for bankruptcy and they're married and there's a means test, right? You have to be under a certain income level to qualify to file a Chapter 7 or to reduce your debts in a Chapter 13. But what's the impact of you're married to having your spouse file with you or not? So if the spouse doesn't file with you, I guess, do we have to include that spouse's income?
You
Is that a way to sneak into a bankruptcy?
No. I mean, if you are living together in the same household and the spouse's income is included in your bankruptcy, so that's not a way to qualify for a 7. You made me think of something. Sometimes people say, oh, well, Susie's credit is good and mine is bad. So I just want to file and not drag her down with me. For whatever reason, her score is close to 700 and his score is whatever it is, 610. And so they're thinking they're going to preserve her good credit so they have that opportunity. And then also maybe keep her ability to file a Chapter 7 in their back pocket if something bad happens later. The ability to file a Chapter 7 in your back pocket, there's almost always a bankruptcy option if you're in trouble, regardless of whether you did a 7 in the last 8 years or not. And of course, the final point being, it's so easy to get a good score within a year after bankruptcy. If you do the right things, that's a concern that is less important than getting rid of the debt so you can start over as a couple. Did that make sense?
Yeah. So a client comes in and says, hey, I don't want to have my spouse file. Her credit score is 720 and mine is 540. What do you advise that client about the impact on the spouse's credit score? Because I can tell you what I say.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you say.
Now I want to hear what you say.
Well, I think I don't have enough information about this specific example to have a sentence yet. It depends. I will say when people are worried about their credit score and filing bankruptcy, I'm going to say, okay, but today, what is your problem? That you owe $40,000 or that you're worried about your credit score? Because the credit score is a tool. It's a tool to save you money when you borrow money. Friend, if you owe 40 grand, you're not borrowing much more.
Right.
You have to take care of that problem first, and then you can worry about your score. And
Right.
frankly, what I know about how credit scores work, getting rid of $40,000 worth of debt generally improves your score.
Yeah, but I get that question, and it's one of those answers from a lawyer standpoint that I would never say, "Oh, yeah, great idea. Your wife's going to keep her credit score," because it just doesn't work that way. There's always these nuances. There's cross stuff that shows up on credit reports that clients don't know about. They never know whether the spouse co-signed or is on the loan together. So if someone comes in and thinks, "Hey, I want to file bankruptcy loan to protect my wife's credit score," I think that's a minor factor, but not the factor, because you're not, one spouse is not going to be able to go through a bankruptcy and necessarily protect the other spouse's credit score. There's just too many factors that come into play. And then also, you're married and you go to apply for a home loan or you go to apply for a car loan, they're often going to want to look at your joint credit score, your credit score individually, but consider you as one. I mean, Wisconsin's a marital property state, a community property state. So when you get married, my friend, you are not two people, you are one person.
Yep. Yep.
And so whether you join in a bankruptcy or not, it's going to impact that spouse, because there's nothing more frustrating from a lawyer standpoint is that when I get a client that calls me and say, "Hey, my spouse is having a problem. She didn't join me in a bankruptcy, and you didn't tell me that it was going to impact her credit." And I'll say, "Friend, we had that conversation," because we have that conversation every time someone filed. There's just no way I can guarantee that I can protect a cosigner's credit score. And there's also no way to protect them from finding out. That's just challenging.
And it's interesting too, because a married couple that doesn't have a good reason to not file together has probably a bunch of good reasons to file together. They start over together, they go through it together, they end up with equivalent scores afterwards. And by the way, they save a bunch of money because really they don't pay very much more than one person filing bankruptcy to file together. Why do one now and another in 4 years and spend that money twice? It doesn't make economic sense.
And ask me the challenging question I have to ask this couple when they say one spouse doesn't want to file.
Jamie, what's the challenging question that you ask?
One of the things that can be challenging, and I did it this morning with the client,
Yeah.
so my wife doesn't want to join. I go, "Are you thinking about getting divorced? Or are you thinking about separating? Are you thinking about harming your spouse?" Because it's a totally different conversation. And when you have that attorney-client relationship, that's a huge factor. You know, my wife doesn't want to join. Does your wife not want to join because you guys are heading in the wrong direction? And that might be a difficult question for a client to answer, but it certainly plays into the conversation. And because sometimes you hear say, "Well, I don't care what happens to my spouse's credit." How do you deal with that?
If my client doesn't care what happens to his or her spouse's credit, then the spouse isn't sitting right there also asking me to be their lawyer. I can counsel them, well, if you're headed towards divorce, this might be a cleaner way to take care of your joint debt. Like, a bankruptcy is much less expensive than fighting over who's going to pay what with each side having a lawyer. So I can have that conversation. What do you do?
Maybe something that I'm going to confirm that in writing with the client, make sure they understand exactly what that means.
Right.
And, we, as lawyers, we often run into that conundrum of, at what point do I have to bring in the other spouse to have this conversation? Because sometimes the time period that it takes for someone to file bankruptcy, they could have come in 6 months ago with their spouse. All of a sudden, they show up 6 months later ready to file, and the spouse that they were with, they're still married, but is all of a sudden not part of the picture.
Right.
So you really need to make sure, did I represent both at that time? Do I have an obligation to talk to the other spouse that I met with 6 months ago? And if you're meeting with a lawyer, that lawyer is good if they're really going to walk through that thought process and manage that issue. One of our best referral sources for those that refer clients to us, our past clients, of course, but our divorce lawyers,
Right.
because divorce lawyers in almost every divorce, it may not need bankruptcy, but they're dealing with how to manage debt. Who's responsible for the mortgage? Who's responsible for the car payment? Who's responsible for the credit card? So fundamentally, when we're dealing with spousal issues and filing bankruptcy, you need to consult with a bankruptcy lawyer. We're always here to help, and we can answer your questions. Well, most of the time we can answer your questions as part of our free consultation, but we're going to be transparent with you. We're going to be honest with you and make sure that we nip any problems early on in the process versus waiting too long and having a problem, or worse yet, having your case go through only later to find out that there's a problem. And maybe that person who you didn't want to join you all of a sudden has to file, and you could have just saved time and money by doing it a while ago.
Right.
So many pitfalls here. So we got planned for the weekend.
Oh, I don't have any plans yet. So probably a little gardening and a little spring cleaning that's not done yet.
That's what you said last week.
Yeah, I didn't do it.
Okay.
Last weekend, I drafted a bunch of stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Summerfest starts today. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
And tomorrow night on the Generac Power Stage is a singer by the name of Charlotte Cardin. You ever heard of her?
No, I don't think so.
She's extraordinary.
Oh,
So she's at 7:45 on that Generac Power Stage. Probably by the time this podcast comes out, which will be in a week or 2 weeks, this will already have happened. But I say that because if you have a moment today, go to your favorite music site and listen to Charlotte Cardin. Would you do that for me?
I will.
Okay. This is our second week of doing podcasting together. Third week already. Okay. How's it going so far?
I think it's awesome are the words that I'm saying out loud.
Okay.
In my head, the imposter syndrome is doing its job, but I'm having a good time. I'm always so happy when we're done.
I know. Can you give me maybe 2 or 3 lines of the Shakespeare that I know you're learning?
Okay. So this is Queen Margaret. She's a little mad at her husband. You need to warn me about this stuff. That's not
I
Queen
know.
Margaret. Enforce thee, art thou king and wilt be forced? I shame to hear thee speak. Thou hast undone thyself, thy son, and me, and given unto House of York such head as thou shalt reign but by their sufferance.
That was, oh my gosh. So translate for us what you just said.
So Henry V, I think, during the War of the Roses, basically made a deal with the Yorks that would allow the Yorks to have the crown after he died and not his own son because he was weak. And his wife, who was Margaret of Anjou, so she was a French princess who married Henry V, basically vows to take up arms and take back the crown for her son. And she is eventually unsuccessful, and her husband is killed and her son is killed. Spoiler alert. And then she spends some time plotting against Richard III and then is sent to France to die.
Love that. That was really well done.
Oh,
And that's not easy. It took me 2 days to learn the bridge to Taylor Swift's Cruel Summer. And you're speaking in Shakespeare. That's very impressive.
Okay.
Very impressive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let's get a puppy wave.
Oh,
Thank you for joining Deborah and I in another edition of the Miller Law Chronicles podcast. Ended on a Shakespeare bang, which was awesome. And if you like us, which I hope you do, please subscribe and like us on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I know you really enjoy it. So Deborah, thank you. Have a great weekend.
thanks, Jamie.
And we'll talk to you soon.